most people, a woodland stream is a pleasant scene of sun and shadow and rippling water. But to an angler, it is a community of many forms of life, all centering, in his mind at least, on the most beautiful and aggressive of freshwater fish, the trout. In this stream, there is a pool where a certain rainbow trout lives, a 6-pound rainbow that rose to one of the flies I drifted across her feeding area. I beached the exhausted fish and sat on the bank to admire my catch. My thoughts turned to the hazards of a trout's existence and the instinct for survival that until now had protected this trout during her long life. A life that began early one spring upstream somewhere, perhaps in the lee of a sunken log where oxygen-rich water rushed over clean gravel. There, two trout began the annual ritual of courtship. The male, hook-jawed and battle-scarred, would have hovered near the female. At first, she would ignore him until she satisfied her instinctive urge to make a nest for her eggs. At the climax, the female would release 1,000 eggs or more, with the male straining at her side to expel a cloud of sperm. Sperm that would touch each egg to start the cycle of life. The female would scatter more gravel over this new generation of trout, then abandon them to the stream. Some eggs would filter down between the stones, and the pulse of life would begin to throb within each one in the days that followed. As the little fish took form, the unremitting effort that survival demands began in a prolonged struggle to break out of the transparent shell. Some would break free only to be trapped in the gravel. Others, yet unable to swim because of the yolk sac that nourished the newly hatched fish, would escape the nest to be swept about and destroyed by the swift current. But the lucky ones would hover under the protective stones until their yolk sacs were absorbed and they could swim. one of the many that slipped out of the gravel and into the stream would grow to be the great trout gasping in my hands. How many years and how many narrow escapes, I asked myself, since this trout first darted with the others to hide in the weedy shallows. The first brush with death may have happened when it reached the apparent safety of tangled roots along the shore, for water scorpions would be there among the roots, waiting to strike at the young fish. Lightning-fast reaction and luck saved many, but some were not quick or lucky enough. Hundreds of the young trout would die in the grip of water scorpions and other insects. Their number would shrink in the months that followed as various predators fed on the school. Adult trout, even their own parents, would devour many of them. But some trout would live to face other dangers. Dangers that threatened from the world above the surface as well as below. Perhaps a kingfisher that can pinpoint its target from a perch 20 feet above the water and drop swiftly to spear a trout with its narrow bill. But not every dive is successful. And if my trout was the target, it avoided the sharp beak and managed to swim away. A log is a good protection against a diving bird, but it can be a pathway of attack for wading birds, like the green heron. One by one, they disappear. each successful encounter with their enemies, the remaining fish became more adept at survival. As they grew too big for one kind of predator, they became prey for others. Larger diving birds like mergansers would fish the stream for the growing trout. Some of the trout would be strong enough to break the merganser's hold. And all of them would be too fast to be caught easily. But the ducks would manage to satisfy their hunger, and there would be fewer trout. With maturity, the surviving trout separate. Now a sizable fish, my trout would take for her own a sheltered area where food floats by or drifts along the bottom. It may have been at this stage in her life that the inexperienced trout first saw a baited hook. And having no reason to associate the line and bobber with danger, took the worm. In her frantic effort to escape, she broke the fisherman's line. But now the bobber trailed behind the fish like an anchor, sure to snag and trap her again. As I imagined this hopeless situation, I thought of one enemy of the trout that might have influenced the outcome: the otter. The otter glides through the water as easily as a trout. Except for its need to come to the surface for air, it is as at home underwater as any fish. Sooner or later, the exploring otter would find the struggling fish. But But when he grabbed the trout at last, he tore the line free of the roots, and in a final desperate effort, the trout broke the otter's hold. And she got away. Leaving to the otter the smaller fish of a later generation. In a short time, the hook worked out of the trout's lip, but the experience was not forgotten. A visible line or an unnatural bait would never deceive her again. In the years that followed, she grew to be the uncontested queen of this remote pool, feeding in the slow current behind a fallen willow tree, where insects float within reach and slugs, snails, and larvae populate the bottom. That's where she was feeding a few years ago when I fished this stream for the first time. The rise startled me. I tried to set up a cast for what I knew must be a huge trout. But it didn't end quite the way I had planned it. But that was long ago, and today my spirits were high as I walked along the stream once more. The inhabitants of the stream side that I saw along the way brought to mind the words of Isaac Walton. "I will walk the meadows," he said, "by some gliding stream, and there contemplate the lilies that take no care, and those very many other living creatures that are not only created but fed, man knows not how, by the God of nature." But unlike Walton's well-governed angler, my contemplation was brief. My thoughts were on the big trout in the pool. At last, I reached it. And there by the fallen willow was a ring in the water. The trout was still there and feeding. It didn't take long to find the cause of the trout's activity. A mayfly hatch was on. I had only one fly that resembled the insect, a ginger cahill. But it takes only one, if it's the right one, and properly placed. There wasn't another fly in the whole box that looked anything like the mayflies hatching on the water. So first, I tried a fan-wing coachman. Then I tied on a goofus bug. Then a spider. Half a dozen flies later, I hadn't had a rise. Yet there was the trout, still feeding on the little mayflies. There was nothing left to do but tie a fly to match them. I clamped a number 12 hook in my fly tying vise and tied on a wisp of hackle for the tail. Then some mandarin feathers for the wings. I finished the fly with several turns of yarn and tied it off. It turned out better than I had expected. Now I took care to watch my back cast. I kept the line in the air until I could drop the fly just upstream of the trout. It was the right fly in the right place. I don't know how long I sat there, reflecting on the way of a trout. I thought of the thousands of eggs this trout might yet spawn, and the great fish like herself that would be her offspring. It occurred to me that all of its enemies except one must destroy the trout to live. Only man has an alternative. And I let her slip away back to her pool.